Hello everyone, I am Harshita. Welcome to our Health Talk session. In this session today we are going to discuss about osteoarthritis. So today we have our doctor who is gonna share his complete knowledge on this today's topic. And before welcoming our doctor, I would like to give a small introduction about him. So Dr. Mohan Puttaswamy is a senior consultant at Fortis Hospital in specialization of joint replacement and reconstructive orthopedic surgeon, and he completed his graduation from Madras Medical College in 2006, and also he topped in the university with 2 gold medals. He worked as assistant and associate professor at Pierce Medical College, and then he moved to New York to complete his fellowship in joint replacement, and also he moved to prestigious Harvard University to complete his fellowship in pediatric orthopedics. And as I already mentioned, from last 7 years he is working as senior consultant at Fortis Hospital in Bannerghatta Road. So let's welcome our doctor, Dr. Mohan Puttaswamy.
So it's a pleasure being with Health Talks. Thanks, Ms. Harshita. Thanks for a warm introduction. It's nice being here. I'm happy that your audience are going to benefit with the discussion we are going to have. And if there's any question, we can discuss on that. Thank you for having me.
Question is, what is arthritis?
So there's a lot of question about arthritis. Arthritis is basically when we take the end of the bone, there's a smooth covering on the bone we call as cartilage. Cartilage is an extremely smooth surface. When there is wearing away of cartilage, that leads to arthritis. In the broad term, arthro is joint, itis is inflammation. And in any inflammatory process in the joint is called as arthritis. We have 2 broad categories. One is inflammatory arthritis, in which we have diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. It's an entire different specialty, lot of complexities, medical management. And the other one is degenerative arthritis, which we commonly call as osteoarthritis. All the elderly people who suffer with chronic joint pains is osteoarthritis. But fundamentally, whenever there is wear and tear of the cartilage, what is an extremely smooth surface becomes a rough surface. That is essentially called as arthritis.
Okay. Which joints are commonly going to affecting
So
from this arthritis?
basically, when we talk of osteoarthritis, there are many joints in the human body which can get affected. So fundamentally, we call them as synovial joints. Any joint which has a lubricating lining can potentially get affected by osteoarthritis. But commonly, the large joints like the knee joint. Surprisingly, the second common joint is the base of the thumb. So there's a base of thumb is a unique joint. So that can lead to arthritis. That's the second most common arthritis. And all the other small hand joints also, if you see 70, 80-year-olds, they have stiffness in the hand, and that is also degenerative arthritis. Luckily, in the Indian subcontinent, we don't see much of hip arthritis, but in the Western population, especially European and American people, there's a lot of hip arthritis. So the common joints are the knee joint and the small joints of hand and feet, predominantly in the hand.
Okay, got it, sir. So what are the risk factors for the osteoarthritis?
So there are basically 2 broad categories. We can put them as modifiable risk factors and non-modifiable risk factors. Talking of non-modifiable risk factors, first and foremost is age. As we get older, there is a risk of degenerative arthritis. So with aging, there is accumulation of breakdown of cartilage. Progressively, when somebody reaches 50, 60, 70 years, the risk of arthritis increases.
Okay, so what is basically because our topic is osteoarthritis today. So what is basically you are going to explain what is that osteoarthritis?
Like I said, osteoarthritis broadly is non-inflammatory arthritis. So inflammatory arthritis is rheumatoid, non-inflammatory is osteoarthritis. When we were talking of risk factors, in the non-modifiable risk factors, the other thing is the female sex. Women form about 70-80% of the patients who have osteoarthritis, whereas the modifiable risk factors, obesity and smoking. People who are obese tend to have higher risk of arthritis, and smokers. So there is some data available which says that smoking worsens arthritis.
Okay. How do you diagnose these disorders?
So broadly, it is based on symptomatology and investigation. So when we talk of symptomatology, we are looking at what are the symptoms the patient come in with. So essentially, patients come in with pain which is worse towards the end of the day, activity related pain, limitation in the range of motion. We have all these elderly people complaining of clicks and noises coming out of the joint, a grinding kind of sensation which they say, and any basic activities, they're climbing stairs, going downstairs, they complain of pain in the joint. So they're all symptoms. Then there are ancillary diagnostic tests, something like a simple X-ray. So we do an X-ray, we look for joint space. So in an X-ray, many times you see bones, cartilage is not seen on X-ray. So you see an empty space, but that empty space essentially is an indirect reflection of the amount of cartilage left. If and when we see bone on bone, it means that the cartilage is completely worn off and a bone is rubbing against the bone. So the classic example I give people is, when we have a fresh pair of tires in a car, it has a smooth friction free movement, and imagine the metal rim of the car rubbing against the road, you have sparks flying. That is bone on bone arthritis. That is a severe end stage osteoarthritis.
Got it. And nowadays so many people are telling that I have took this injection and I have taken the injection about for 5,000, 10,000 and all. So what is your thought about it? Like which injection is better for this arthritis?
So see, there is medical management and there is injection. So before talking of injections, let us talk about what are the medical management. Okay. So basically when we talk of injections, they are in the last but one stage of management. So we can broadly, this is probably not a very scientific classification, we can call as mild, moderate and severe arthritis. So the progression of arthritis from mild to severe arthritis takes about 5 to 8 years of time. So vast majority of arthritis is managed by community physicians, sometimes surgeons, and before they come to us, they would have met a lot of people. So what I mean by that is, physicians put them on pain medications, people are self-medicating, they're trying all sort of Ayurvedic, homeopathy and a lot of other tricks which people want to do for themselves. Then they meet surgeons and some surgeons use a few injections, and finally it progresses to severe arthritis where the treatment is surgery. Now when you asked about injection, before that let's talk of medicine. So in the treatment of osteoarthritis, basically simple medicine is the key. More than what to do, we should be aware of what not to do. General thumb rule is we have to discourage usage of strong painkillers in osteoarthritis, because painkillers, if you take for a long period of time, they can damage the kidney. So we generally advise our patients,
because it's common nowadays, everybody for any pain, people are going to take the painkillers.
It's unfortunate, it's become fancy. People have this thought process that, why do I meet a doctor, let me go to the pharmacy, he'll give me a painkiller.
Even I do that, yeah.
We honestly discourage that sort of thing, because an injury pain is different, but in a degenerative pain, we're not curing. So the more painkillers you take, say imagine you took painkiller for 2 years, essentially a lot of people can suffer from kidney damage. So it's an irreversible damage. So the general suggestion is paracetamol. So anybody who has pain can take something like Dolo 650 or Calpol 500 once, twice, thrice a day after food to manage pain. And the other beautiful thing what they can do is topical gel. So any sort of painkiller gel is fine. If they want to use Ayurvedic oils, that is perfectly fine. Or if they want to use any of the over-the-counter medicated gels, any painkiller ointment or gel is perfectly all right. They just have to gently rub on the joint, use a hot pack. After they rub, after 5 to 10 minutes, keep the hot pack on the knee joint, and that helps in relief of symptoms. So medications wise, I generally suggest people to start off with simple paracetamol and topical gel for self-management.
Okay. Yes, got it. And in which condition you are going to say that we can go for the surgery, and what are the treatments are involved in this, especially in arthritis?
Okay. So again, to answer this question, we spoke about injections. So in injections, we have broadly 3 categories of injections. The first one is steroid injections. They are fairly effective, gives quick relief of symptoms, very reasonably priced, or they're fairly cheap. But whenever we give steroid injections, that increases the degenerative process, that actually worsens the osteoarthritis. So steroids is used in a very select subset of population. So in my practice, what I generally do is a patient who is not a candidate, a 80-year-old lady who has to go for a family function or she has to go on a trip, she is not able to walk, she doesn't want surgery, that is a patient for whom I advise a steroid injection. The other two injections are, we call it as platelet rich plasma and the hyaluronic acid, the viscosupplement injection. So the data regarding both are not robust. So there are studies which are published, some surgeons believe in viscosupplementation and some surgeons believe in platelet rich plasma, but broadly when we look at the data and trials, platelet rich plasma tends to do better than viscosupplement. The advantage of PRP is, platelet has anti-inflammatory cells. What I mean by that is, simple layman term, even though there is water in the earth, if we put a seed on the soil, it is not going to germinate because it's a matter of access. So there is no access for the seed to reach the water. So similarly, cartilage doesn't have blood supply. Even though the bone is having blood supply, there is no access for those growth factors to reach the cartilage. So essentially what we do is, like drill a borewell, take out the water and put it to the seed. So it's a process of creating access for the anti-inflammatory cells. So we take out the blood, process it, take the concentrated growth factors from the platelet and inject into the joint. So once we create the access, the hope is, the anti-inflammatory cells of the platelets reduce the inflammation, protect the cartilage, and then there are some positive growth factors which help in renewal of cartilage. Again, platelet rich plasma is marketed as a panacea. You can see that some people tend to market it as saying that, it's a no-brainer, it is going to cure arthritis. The short answer is no. It is going to help in mild to moderate arthritis where there is some cartilage. Only when cartilage is there, PRP is going to be effective. Lastly, when we spoke of this hyaluronic acid injection, the various brands of hyaluronic acid, you have moderate viscosity, high viscosity, different molecular weight of hyaluronic acid. So basically, with viscosupplements, there is a broad spectrum of positives, overrated positives, or studies. If we look at robust data, some people say it is equal to placebo. But there is no harm, we can obviously try it. The only matter of concern is going to be the cost. So a good viscosupplement will cost anywhere around 10,000 for one knee. So if we are doing for both knees, it costs about 20,000, and if we have to repeat over a period of 2 to 3 times, it's not cheap. So it's a bit expensive. If money is not a concern, definitely injections are an option we can try before we think of a surgical treatment. So regarding surgery, I think that's an entire topic of discussion. But broadly, in the older age group, somebody in their 60s, 70s, we do a knee replacement. Once they reach an end stage arthritis, the final solution is a total knee replacement. The challenge is not in the end stage arthritis. The challenge is in the people who are in severe arthritis but who are younger. So there are a couple of other surgical options. So somebody in their 50s has bad single compartment arthritis. What I mean by single compartment is the inner side of the knee joint tends to wear away faster. So in single compartment arthritis, we have two options available. One is what we call as a high tibial osteotomy. This is, it's an age-old process in the 40s, 50s when we did not have joint replacement. Surgeons were trying to see how we can sort it out. A surgery was evolved. Essentially, we create a fracture. We break the bone, realign the bone so that the stresses on the knee joint is different, and that helps in redistribution of stresses and relief of pain. That is osteotomy. The other thing which I was talking about is a unicompartment arthroplasty. So instead of replacing the whole knee, we replace the worn out knee. It's called as a partial knee replacement. So that partial knee replacement is effective in the slightly younger age group. So broadly, this is how we make the decisions in treating the arthritis.
Okay. Yes, sir. So how does one know that yes, I have to go for a knee replacement?
So this is a very important question because we see a lot of patients, they come in and say, sir, I have been told that my knee is worn off, I need a knee replacement. Sometimes for patients it's hard to decide when to have it. So my general thumb rule is, in my practice, knee replacement is never given. It's always taken. What I mean by that is, a patient of knee replacement should have exhausted all the medical management available for knee replacement surgery. Every non-surgical treatment should be exhausted. until unless we reach there, we should not advise a knee replacement. Essentially, what I mean by that is, so they have tried medications, they have tried gels, they have tried injections, it's not worked. Then people sometimes want to use braces. See, like there are a lot of knee braces available. We have knee caps, we have something called as offloader brace. And if all of them have been tried not helpful, then we think of surgery. The simplest thumb rule is, if a patient is able to use an Indian toilet, squat in an Indian toilet, or if they are able to sit cross-legged and have food, they don't need a knee replacement. It's as simple as that. So it's in severe arthritis, it's practically impossible to sit cross-legged on the ground and have comfortably for a few minutes and have food, or sit without discomfort in an Indian toilet. So this is a broad thumb rule. And radiologically, we wait for the pain. Radiologically, we wait for it to reach the bone and bone stage. But the bottom line is, we call it as end stage arthritis, where pain has become so bad that the quality of life is affected. So, if we have a 70-year-old who is able to manage, the X-ray might look bad, but we can still wait. But if there's a 55-year-old where they have severe limitation of quality of life, they're not able to walk to the restroom, then unfortunately, when no other option is available, we suggest surgery. So it is pain which decides the timing of surgery, and it is the patient who decides when to have surgery. That's the end point. Surgeon has no role, but only patient symptoms decide when they will undergo a knee replacement surgery.
Yes, depends on the patient's condition.
Yes.
Okay. So what is the preparation for this surgery?
So see, knee replacement is an extremely elective surgery. One of the things what has happened in our system is, unfortunately, knee replacement is being treated something like a semi-urgent or a urgent surgery. So which is a wrong approach. So you can definitely prepare. See, in the Western setup, say in the European systems or in the American system, during my fellowship training, I worked with a guy called Ken Krakow. So Ken always used to say that his booking was so busy that patients used to get slot 6, 7, 8 months after the first visit. So in their system, the patient comes, sees the surgeon, has a waiting period of 3 to 6 months or whatever, based on the busyness of the surgery of the surgeon. So they go back to their primary care physician, and the primary care physician processes the patient for surgery. In India, we don't have it. So what I mean by that is, see, preparation is twofold. One is preparing the surroundings for the surgery. Two, preparing the patient themselves for surgery. See, if you visit my website in irie.co.in, I have put together a process of how to prepare the surrounding and themselves. So in short, let me explain. So preparation of the surrounding is, so post surgery patients will not be able to comfortably use the toilet. So if they have a low seat toilet, they have to use a commode raiser. Then they'll find it very difficult to bend down and take things. So they'll have to make arrangements in the house so that their things which they use are easily accessible. That is preparing the ecosystem. In India, it's not a big deal because you have family members, you have kids, somebody who will take care of you. So in the West, this is extremely important. But preparation of the patient. So when we look at the data, about 70-80% of patients have medical comorbidity. See, somebody is diabetic, has urinary infection or anemia. All of these things have adverse effect on the outcome. So I think my biggest challenge or my biggest learning point in the Indian practice over the last 7 years is, I lose about 20-30% of the patients thinking that this doctor is asking me to come after 6 weeks or 8 weeks, because I do what is called as a health optimization protocol. This is something which is extremely necessary. This is robust, data driven, but unfortunately our system is still not geared up for it. So what I mean by that is, you assess for anemia, you look for urinary infections, you look at malnutrition in the patient, and you correct it pre-surgically. So this is a process we call as health optimization, and also there is something called as prehabilitation. So before you undertake a surgery, put the patient through a proper exercise program. So prepare the patient, prepare the joint, and prepare the ecosystem. So by doing all this, you are going to reduce the risk of complications after a surgery.
Okay, got it. So, what is the process? Like, how many days I should be in the hospital? Then, how many months I have to take the rest?
So, see, again, there is a lot of myths about knee replacement. So, when you talk of process, typically after the health optimization is done for my patient, they come either the previous day, before the day of surgery, or early morning on the day of surgery. So, usually I schedule my surgery in 2 slots. If I am operating in the morning, I generally ask them to come the previous day, or if they are in the afternoon session, I ask them to come early in the morning. So, keep them nil by mouth for 6 hours. The anesthetist would have given the instructions, just follow the instructions. One of the most important thing is we do what is called as proper bath before a knee replacement. This is something again which has come up recently. There's medicated soaps which we give for our patients. They take a bath 12 hours before, and even just in the early mornings we give them a bath, so that we reduce the bugs. We have organisms in the skin. We want to reduce those organisms, give them a bath, and then prepare them for a surgery. So, if once the surgery is done, the stay in the hospital is decided fundamentally based on patient factors, in the sense that the time needed for them to safely take care of themselves in the toilet, able to climb a flight of stairs and manage their pain with all the other parameters, the heart, lung, kidneys, if they are all right, then we can discharge. So, that typically in an Indian setup takes about 4 to 5 days. So, in the Western setup, there is something called as accelerated pathways. So, a place like San Francisco or New York, where there is a robust system, where there is a health nurse can quickly go there, they are following accelerated pathways. See, I get a lot of international patients. Their biggest question is, doc, can we go home in 24, 48, 72 hours? So, there is concept of daycare surgeries come in joint replacement, but generally that is over ambitious. In the West, they have done it for cost containment. In our Indian system, I do not think it is such a big necessity. So, my thumb rule, when the patient is safely able to do all their work, going to the restroom, able to eat by themselves, pain is reasonably tolerated by oral medication, then I discharge them, which takes about 4-5 days.
So, we are completely discussing about this knee replacement. So, what is replacement?
So, see, I think this is one of the most oversold, misunderstood surgeries in the world. I get questions that, doctor, are you going to cut my leg off and put a lot of metal into the leg? So, essentially, if I can show this model, see, in a knee replacement, we basically have 3 bones which form the knee joint. We have the thigh bone, which we call as femur. We have the leg bone, which we call as tibia, and we have the kneecap we call as patella. So, when we replace these 3 surfaces, we call it total knee replacement. So, in the thigh bone, the end of the bone is about 8 millimeter thick. So, the metal is about 8 millimeter thick. We only cut 8 millimeters of bone. So, and in the leg bone, which is tibia, again between the metal and the combined plastic thickness is about 10 millimeters. So, we cut 10 millimeters of bone. So, essentially it is what we call as resurfacing arthroplasty. So, in resurfacing arthroplasty, we will have whatever is being cut, we replace it only. And in some patients, when we need to resurface the patella, some people resurface, some people do not resurface, that is a very scientific debate. But fundamentally, there is a plastic liner which is available for the kneecap as well. So, we replace that, and that is totally replacement. So, essentially a metal cap for the thigh bone, a metal cap for the leg bone with an extremely smooth plastic in between, and a plastic cap for the kneecap we call as patella. So, this is totally replacement.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So, yes, is there any different designs of knee?
So, see, it all goes back in time. So, the innovation started in the 1970s. 2-3 centers in UK started doing the early designs, and there are a couple of centers in the US where they started doing early designs. So, the designs evolved over a period of time. So, right now, if you ask me, there are 2 broad categories. One is called as mobile bearing knee, and the other one is called as a fixed bearing knee. So, here is one which we have removed from a patient. So when we talk of this is a fixed bearing design. So in a fixed bearing design, what happens is this plastic liner is fixed to the metal component. So this is a fixed bearing knee. Whereas if we talk of a mobile bearing knee, this plastic which is there rotates on this metal liner. So these are two broad categories. But as the technology has progressed, I think mobile bearing knees have come fairly less usage in the community, and largely it is a fixed bearing. Now when we talk of this, even before this evolution happened, there was something called as an all poly knee. So all poly knees even today they do well. Just because they are older design doesn't mean they are bad. So what it means is there is no metal component. So the entire plastic component we put it in the leg bone, we cement it, and the movement happens between these two components. Again, all poly is considered inferior, but when we look at the data, both the registry data and survivorship data, all polys are not bad. Now regarding the present generation, when you ask broadly, so this is what we call as a CR knee. So in a CR knee, you don't have any metal here, you don't have a box essentially. So this freely moves, and this is what we call as a CR knee. So there is another design which we call as a PS knee. In a PS knee, there will be a metal connecting bar which has a box. So basically these are two broad categories of knee replacement. So in a fixed bearing, a CR knee design and a PS knee design. So this is what is essentially largely used across the world as we speak today.
Okay, which is the best implant?
So when people ask me this question, the answer I give is which is the best car. So do you consider Benz the best car, or Audi the best car, or even Hyundai? So you have multiple companies with multiple brands of cars. So essentially it all goes back to again innovation. So if we look at the supply chain, Ford started off the I think the T model or something in the 1900s, and that I think it was about 100 years back, that has revolutionized automobile. So even in joint replacement surgery, early designs and designers started off certain schools of thought. Now that in the last 50 years is broadly divided into various companies, and those designers have started off making certain products. Generally speaking, most companies internationally manufactured implants do well. So there is something called as ODEP ratings. So it's called as Orthopedic Devices Evaluation Panel from UK. So people can go on ODEP, and if a surgeon is trying to tell this is the best product, they can look at the survivorship data on ODEP rating. So that is an objective analysis. And the most important thing I tell my patients is the latest prosthesis is not the greatest prosthesis. Some people tend to say this is the best prosthesis in the market, it's doing phenomenally well. I would not generally agree to that. My viewpoint and my belief system is a bit more conservative. I want to use implant which is there in the market for more than 10 years, so that we have robust data available to say that, see, I use a couple of companies. Both the implants are available in the market for more than 10 years now. So I can confidently tell my patient that, in the last 10 years, the survivorship is more than 95%. So I think that is the best way to do in our system, rather than experimenting with newer implants, because we don't know their long term in vivo survival.
Yes, and also before knee replacement, so doctor is going to suggest that we have to take anesthesia and all. So what type of anesthesia you are going to suggest?
So as a surgeon, generally I will not suggest this type of anesthesia. I will let it to my anesthesia colleagues to decide. But broadly there are two anesthesias which we give. So one is called as general anesthesia, the other one is called as regional anesthesia. Regional anesthesia is basically what they give in the back. So spinal and epidural anesthesia. Irrespective of that, see, anesthesia is basically appropriate pain relief with patient optimization. Some patients are extremely apprehensive. The funny thing is, people ask before surgery, their imagination of the operating room setup is, doctor, we thought you are extremely serious, you are always thinking of the patient. But when they listen, even though when we are operating, we are talking about politics, we are talking about sports, so that makes people anxious. So it is not irresponsibility. That's generally the way we operate. It's motor memory. So for somebody who's done hundreds of knee replacement, your hands keep flowing. The entire team is geared up for it. But we are still talking of other things, but we are working. So for that sense, we ask our patients, if they are extremely apprehensive, they talk to the anesthetist and they sedate the patient. But broadly, you have regional and general anesthesia.
Okay, so don't mind for this question. I have interviewed so many surgeons. So they are going to say, I'm the best and our institution is the best. So what is your thought? Even I hope you are going to say the same thing.
So see, I would never claim that I am the best joint replacement surgeon. I think that's a wrong notion. So there is nothing called as who's the best replacement surgeon. I think the question itself is framed wrong. So the idea is about competence. It's not about who's the best, because I think that's a wrong approach to the question. What I mean by a best surgeon and a best institution, at least in my opinion, is from a surgeon's point of view, he should be competent, well trained, knowledgeable, skillful. So this is what a surgeon brings to the table. Essentially, their subspecialty domain training. So a general orthopedic surgeon approaches it with a broad brush and a broad thought process. So when I say I'm a fellowship trained surgeon, so during my fellowship I was trained with, like I said, with this guy called Ken Krakow. So this mentorship, what it gives is, it takes away the edges, makes you a better surgeon. You learn the finer tricks of the trade, nuances of joint replacement surgery. So that is from a surgeon's point of view. From an institution point of view, I'll be very honest with you. So when I say I'm working in Fortis, the money I make per case is much less than what somebody can make in a nursing home. And if a patient pays about 2.5 lakhs in present terms for a knee replacement in Fortis, in a nursing home, some people can operate in 2 lakhs. But it is about the infrastructure. So especially in a knee replacement surgery, we are replacing a function which has to work for 20-30 years. So if it is done in suboptimal condition, in the sense that the OT is not ultra clean, or the operating table which we use at Fortis is called as a Mackay table, which costs 30, 40, 50 lakhs. Whereas in a Indian made table, in a nursing home, they can do that. The OT table are available at 4-5 lakhs. Similarly, the equipment we use to cut the bone. So if there are expensive equipment which are imported, which costs about 20 lakhs, or local made or regionally made equipment are available for 2-3 lakhs. So it is the input cost which determines the output cost. So the hospitals have invested a ton of money in the operating room, ton of money in the technology. So that increases the cost. Per surgery, what I actually take home is less. But for me, what is fundamentally important is what we can deliver to the patient. So that is how you should choose between the institution and the surgeon.
During knee replacement, do we need blood transfusion?
Okay, so knee replacement is a surgery where people tend to lose about 1 liter of blood. So that is approximately about 20% of the blood volume we have. So in my practice, I follow what is called as health optimization. Again, if the patient is anemic, build up the hemoglobin to a level where they are able to tolerate blood transfusion. Do we really need to give blood transfusion? Yes. So again, it depends on what type of surgery. If both knees are done simultaneously, patients will most likely require blood transfusion. But at least in what I do, the way I do, single knees, very rarely do I have to give blood. Both knees, again, depending on the scenario, we decide and give blood.
What is the success rate of this knee replacement?
So success has to be defined in terms of pain relief and satisfaction. So there is this misconception that it is a 100% successful surgery. Knee replacement in more than 90 to 95% of patients will give pain relief. Whereas satisfaction is something a little more complicated. So the satisfaction rates of knee replacement is around 85%. About another 5-10% of people are okay, but not greatly satisfied. and about 5% of people are truly not satisfied. If you look at the X-ray, it looks fantastic, well done surgery, but the patients are not satisfied. One of the hypotheses is basically a knee replacement is a three-dimensional. When we talk of kinematics, the knee replacement the knee bends, it rotates like this and it moves like this. So there are three movements which happen. So flexion, extension, rotation and translation. There is no implant in the world which is available, which is able to do all the three at the same point of time. So that is why your satisfaction rates are not extremely great, 80 to 85%, and the pain relief is 90 to 95%. Even more important, all this data is from a Western setup. So when we look at Indian patients, see, we do a fair amount of revision replacement, where patients are not satisfied, not well done surgery or complications. Overall, in an Indian scenario, I think the satisfaction rate is somewhere around 70 to 75% based on where it is done, how it is done, and pain relief will definitely be there. So large number of patients will have relief of pain, and also it is about giving a realistic opinion to the patient. See, I have seen patients who come back and tell that, somebody told there's a new design which gives you 150 degrees of knee bending, or there's a new implant which will last 30 years. All of this is marketing. So I don't think, there are some people who might oversell, or patients' expectation might be extremely high. So what knee replacement fundamentally does is it's going to relieve only knee pain. See, if patient has foot arthritis, back pain, they are not going to become normal. Their knee pain will go away, but their other problems will still persist. So success has to be defined in a holistic term. Sit with the patient, their family, and then explain to them that this is what you will get, this is what most likely will happen, and thereby saying that they are realistic. If we give too much of optimism, they might feel dissatisfied. There is data to back it up. So realistically speaking, will they have pain relief? Most of them will have pain relief. Their satisfaction rate based on expectations is around 85%.
Okay, got it. And any complications of during knee replacement?
So, like any other surgery, knee replacement will have complications. So there is no surgery which is 100% successful. Now, one of my worrisome thing is, I've heard a lot of patients who come and say, doctor, can you guarantee that will not have complications? My answer is no. If any surgeon is giving you 100% success rate, don't go to them. They're lying. So complications are part of the whole surgical process. Now, there can be major complications, minor complications. When we look at data, death, 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2,000 people can die immediately after knee replacement surgery. That is, because of the stress on the heart. Some people can have a heart attack. Strokes can happen. So it is based on how we handle them. So if patients are a little high risk category, we shouldn't do both knees at the same point of time. You do one knee, give a 3 months gap, then do the other. That is one way of reducing complications. But what I spoke, heart attack, stroke, death, these are all rare complications. Realistically speaking, from a patient point of view, the most important complication they should know is infection. So now across the world, a ton of research is being done. How do we reduce infection? Because infection happens based on the patient cohort we see is around 1 to 1.5%. Now that, from a patient's point of view, will seem a negligible number. But statistics is a funny beast. If it happens to you, it's 100%. If it doesn't happen to you, it's 0. So even that 1% is too much. But unfortunately, there's no way we can reduce it, because when people become obese, bad protoplasm in the patient, heart lungs which are being bad. So infection is higher in such patient population, and also if the surgery is not done in the right environment, that increases the risk of infection. So basically what we have seen is pathway driven surgery. So if a proper care pathway is used, the complication rates go down. So infection is the biggest complication which patients need to be aware. Then there are other complications which we tend to see, something called atelectasis. After surgery, they can have anesthesia related complications. In a lying down position, they can have lung related issues, urine retention, difficulty in passing urine. All of those are minor complications which we handle. The other thing which we are aware, which recently is come into limelight, a lot of medical legal issues, is what we call as deep vein thrombosis. Basically, it is like clots form in the legs. They go to the lungs, and some 1 in 10,000 times they can kill the patient. So it's called as pulmonary embolism. So we do a lot of techniques to prevent deep vein thrombosis. Some patients driven, some doctor driven. We give certain exercises, stockings, and medications. With all that, we cannot prevent it. We can reduce the incidence. So what patients need to be aware is infection as a major, clot as minor to major complication. The other things are fracture. Elderly bones are weak. Sometimes when we are using an implant, the bone can break. It's unfortunate, but it happens many a time. So the other things are surgeon driven, in the sense if the knee joint is not well balanced. So we call it as balancing. So if the proper both inside and outside has to be properly balanced. If the knee is not balanced, or even in this movement if the knee is not balanced, so that is called as imbalanced knee. And in the long run, when we talk of survivorship, see, when this keeps happening over, on an average we say 1 million cycles a year, over 20 years it's about 20 million cycles, it becomes loose. So the surface between the metal and the bone can become loose, which we call as aseptic loosening, or the plastic can wear away. With time the plastic keeps wearing away, micrometers keeps wearing away over a period of time. That is a long term complication. Aseptic loosening is a long term complication. Infection can happen anytime, early after a surgery it can happen, or it can happen after 10 years. So these are the broad complications which patients need to be aware of.
Okay. After the replacement, after the surgery, so the pain, how long it will be there?
So see, pain is a subjective sensation. I have had patients, I remember one patient from Tumkur. I did his surgery. Second day he says, doctor, I did not need painkillers. I only took Dolo. I was surprised. Then I have patients who come back after 3 months. They are like, doctor, mera BB gutna dukh raha hai. So it's an extremely subjective sensation. But overall, when we look at the broad cohort of patients, the patients need painkillers, IV painkillers for about 3 to 4 days, oral painkillers for about 2 to 3 weeks. After that, occasionally they will have pain for 6 weeks. And the relief of pain, we call it as geometric and arithmetic progression. So 80% of recovery, geometric recovery, happens in the first month to 6 weeks. So then month on month there is a slow recovery. Even up to a year people make progress. So yes, knee replacement is a painful surgery, but with modern techniques, anesthesia and our perioperative management, pain is very tolerable by oral medications after discharge. 5-6 days, you just need oral tablets to manage pain.
Okay. So after the surgery, some people may say, I'm feeling some drowsy and even I was sleepless. So what is your thought on that?
So again, there is robust data to support that, the first 6 weeks, there is change in sleep cycle. We don't understand why it happens, but night times they don't tend to sleep well, whereas mornings they feel drowsy. So is it anesthesia related? It's a poorly understood mechanism. So what we generally advise our patients is afternoons and mornings tend to avoid sleeping, watch TV, talk to family, do some exercises, dumbbells, and keep yourself active. So night times they'll be able to sleep, but this happens for about 6 weeks. The same thing with appetite. People have loss of appetite, that it doesn't taste well. So all of this will be there for about 4 to 6 weeks, which automatically disappears. And if it becomes a niggle or a problem, we handle with medication.
Okay. So how long should I use a walker or supportive instrument?
So I hope you don't have a knee replacement. You don't need to use it. So
like usually, yeah.
Say an elderly patient, when they undergo a knee replacement, basically they need to use it till they are confident. What I mean by that is, see, I have a 70-year-old person whom I do a knee replacement. I ask them to use walker for about 6 weeks, and for the rest of their life, I ask them to use a cane. Whereas if it's a 60-year-old patient, very active, pre-surgically, ask them to use walker for a couple of weeks, transition to a cane in a month, nothing. So it is individualized, but broadly speaking, again, 3 weeks of walker, 3 weeks of cane, and based on how they progress, they can decide to use the cane or not to use the cane.
Okay. And after 2 or 3 months, people may come by saying that I have swelling and all. So what do we have to do for that?
See, that's a good question. So swelling, we have any leg swelling, the surgeon's mind has got an alarm which rings that is there a DVT. So basically, there is benign swelling. Most patients after knee replacement have a benign swelling, in the sense that gravity dependent swelling, because any surgery on the lower extremity, the lymphatics and the venous outflow is not great. So there is going to be swelling. The best thing is early in the morning they see there is no swelling, end of the day there is swelling. So swelling is in itself is not alarming. So we generally ask people to use pillows below the ankle so that gravity drainage happens. But any persistent swelling or discomfort, we tend to rule out deep vein thrombosis, and we are fairly liberal in using Doppler scan. Ensure there is no DVT happening. If there is no clot in the leg, patient can sleep at peace, doctor can sleep at peace. Up to 3 to 6 months, patients can have swelling of the leg.
Okay. And most of the people maybe have this question. So after replacement, when can I drive or when can I go for work and all? So what is your answer?
Okay. So it depends on what sort of work. See, replacement is done mainly in the elderly. I don't think they're doing any manual work. So if they have to go back to a desk sort of job, somebody is a manager or a higher level position, then we suggest wait for about 3 to 4 weeks. So like, the sleep cycle, tiredness, all of this will persist. So a 3 to 4 week window is okay. But again, see, I do a fair amount of international patients, people coming from Iraq, Yemen, even Australia. So all of these patients cannot wait in the country for so much time. So what we do is operate. Once a stitch removal is done for about 2 weeks later, they can fly home. Appropriate precautions, we have a template for it. We say that and they go back. But return to work is about 4 weeks. And driving, a lot of studies have shown that about 5 to 6 weeks is the time required for them to confidently drive. See, some people say I have an automatic, so can I drive immediately? Now, if it's a left knee automatic, they want to drive early. But again, going back to Ken, Krakow always used to say that your grandson is there, you are driving. Can you safely drive when your grandson is in front of you? The day you reach that, that's the final proof of driving. Bottom line, 6 to 8 weeks for driving a car. Two-wheeler, I generally suggest people to wait more than 2 months because I want them to be a little more comfortable. For some elderly patients of mine, I ask them completely not to drive a two-wheeler, because if there is a fracture, if they fall and break a bone, handling that is a lot more complicated than just without an implant. So to avoid or prevent a complication, we suggest just don't drive two-wheeler. So that would be for driving.
Okay. After surgery, surgeon may tell that obviously they'll tell you how to take these medications or antibiotics. So how long we have to take? I mean, people are going to take that antibiotics.
So antibiotics is something, like this whole antibiotic abuse is happening. Generally, I don't suggest post-surgical antibiotics. So the role of antibiotics is when they undergo a procedure. Even this is controversial, but generally to prevent a problem, if somebody has to undergo a dental work, say elderly have dental issues, they want to undergo a root canal or whatever, manipulation of the oral cavity, we ask them to take amoxicillin 1 gram before the procedure and 6 hours after the dental work. They need prophylactic antibiotic. But other than that, generally they don't need to take any sort of antibiotic for a lengthy period of time to prevent infection.
Okay. And when people can start their sexual activities?
So this, see, in a knee replacement, sexual activity is not a big limitation. In a hip replacement, yes, we have very important protocol driven things, what position and when to have it. In a knee replacement, typically whenever they are pain free. So again, like I said, in the pain management, about 4 to 6 weeks is a window when they can resume their intimate activities.
Okay. How much of motion range should be needed?
So, okay. So people have this doubt about how much knee bending is necessary.
Yeah.
So basically in a native knee, the amount of knee bending is about based on their thigh size, the calf size, anywhere from 90 degrees to 140 degrees. Very extremely thin lady can bend almost 140 degrees. Obese lady can only bend 110 degrees. So the most important determinant of post-surgical range of motion, so that is after surgery, how much range of motion will come, is decided by pre-surgical range. If my patient had only 50 degrees of knee bending, I don't think they'll get 120, 130 degrees of knee bending. Whereas if a person had full knee bending, usually they get back about 120, 130 degrees of knee bending. So what we understand is how much is necessary. So essentially for most routine activities, say climbing stairs, climbing downstairs, sitting on a chair, 110 to 120 degrees is more than enough. So if a patient gets 120 degrees of knee bending, that is enough for most activities of daily living. So I had a lady who came from Andhra. I had done a knee replacement, stage knee, first one knee, then after the other knee. 2 months later, she came back extremely happy, and the daughter is telling, doctor, my mother is using an Indian toilet also. So, deep down you are happy that she's got good range of motion, but I kind of scolded them saying that don't squat in an Indian toilet. So one of the most important advice we give our patients is you should not squat them. Even if they are able to squat, the range of motion will go down. The survivorship will go down. Range of motion will be there. Long-term survivorship will get affected by extreme deep bending. So generally speaking, one of the activity limitation is deep squatting. So not a great advice. It's not advisable to deep squat. So 120 degree movement is enough. But for this Asian population, to encourage squatting for religious purposes, somebody wants to do namaz, so they need to kneel on the ground. So this whole deep, there's this whole high flex design which came up. In my practice, generally I don't advise patients for high flex designs because it's mostly a marketing tool than a scientific tool. So high flex designs have not made big difference. Based on skill, competence and patient factors, range of motion is decided, but 120 degrees is enough for most routine activities.
Already you have given lots of information. So, but I have last one question. So, coming to the technology. So, even I read regarding about robotics, especially. Are they involved in this knee replacement?
So, see, the way I would answer this is, a lot of technology is being brought in with the hope that it will improve outcomes. So, but in the last 40, 50 years of existence of knee replacement, there are very few technologies which have made big quantum difference. So many times my worry is technology being used just for a cosmetic purpose, or is it really going to help the patient? Now again, see, I review a lot of papers for Journal of Arthroplasty. So when I read these papers, one of the things which glaringly comes out is, people do studies and use technology many times just for the technology's sake. Now I might have to eat my words, but whole robotics came in certain oncology and urology procedures, and that was extrapolated to orthopedics. So will robotic help? Yes, it will help. But the problem is the cost. Each robo today existing in the market costs 6, 7, some cost even more than 10 crores. So is there a value proposition? So when we look at it, we look at outcomes. Will a robo help to increase survivorship, improve pain? Then blindly I would use a robo to do the knee replacement. Not that I have it, but if a hospital has it, I don't mind using it. But till date, there's no data which says that using a robo will increase either patient satisfaction, implant survivorship, or outcomes. There are some studies which talk of short-term outcome differences, but in the long term, it has not made a difference. Then there is another technology called navigation. So navigation prices have dropped. Yes, it helps in doing a knee replacement. Somebody who's not very well versed with knee replacement, low volume surgeon, early learners, navigation does help. But again, it is like using a GPS. If you know the way to drive, it will, if you are a routine driver in that traffic, you don't need a GPS. But if you are a newcomer, you want to use a GPS. So this is pretty much the same thing. Navigation is a tool which uses technology, CT scan, everything to try to help doing the surgery better. But again, they have not made, navigation is there in the market for 20 years. So it's not made any difference in patient outcomes or satisfaction. So that is a main caveat when we talk of technology. So there was a lot of fancy stuff, when we talked of trying to use something called as patient specific instrumentation. They were a big thing, but again, they did not make any difference in outcome. Is there a role for technology? Absolutely yes, but they have to be robust, data driven. Then I have no problem using technology. But my worry is using technology for the technology's sake. I am not a big believer. A well done knee replacement without any fancy gadgets will still give good outcomes if the surgeon knows the principle, select the right patients, appropriate techniques of doing surgery, existing implants, patients will do well.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. And it's the end of this session. And seriously, I'll be most thankful. It is going to helpful for others also. And yeah, thank you once again.
It's been my pleasure. So the whole idea is, if your audience, wherever they are, if they're able to benefit from our conversation, these are all foundational principles, basically to guide them to make decisions, and that's the whole purpose.
Concept,
Thank you for having me.